With Pet Sounds, I wanted to write some songs that reflected how I really felt about life. Something that I felt in my soul, rather than just car songs, surf songs, you know. Something more introspective, like taking a good look at yourself, see how you feel, and then see what you should do to improve yourself. That was my way of coping with those kind of things that come up in every man's life. I tried to make it the most artistic, loving album ever made.
In the early 60s, no American band sounded more like the sound of summer than the Beach Boys. Their harmonies were sweet, their lyrics simple, and their image clean. Surfboards, cars, and California girls were all part of their picture-perfect dream. But by the end of '65, their creative leader, Brian Wilson, was no longer dreaming of the beach. The world was changing. Pop music was growing up, and the Beatles had just released Rubber Soul, an album that at the time was noted for its ambition. And when Brian heard it, he didn't just hear competition, he heard a challenge. Rubber Soul blew my mind, Brian said. It was a whole album of great songs, not just hits. I said, I'm gonna make the greatest rock album ever made. Back home in California, while the rest of the Beach Boys toured Japan and the American South, Brian stayed at home, writing and producing their new sound. He had stopped performing live the previous year, worn down by anxiety, perfectionism, and the pressure to deliver hit after hit. This bold move would later be replicated by none other than the Beatles. In '66, the boys from Liverpool did what Brian did a year before. Quit touring and focus entirely on writing and recording exciting new sounds. Coincidence? Well, John Lennon had this to say in December of 1965. It's all Brian Wilson. He just uses the voices as instruments. He never tours or does anything. He just sits at home thinking up fantastic arrangements in his head. The road was too much for me, Brian confessed. I had a nervous breakdown. I needed to be in the studio. That's where I could breathe. Brian began writing music that was deeply personal, songs about insecurity, heartbreak, and the ache of growing up. It was no longer about surfing or girls in bikinis. This was something else entirely. He wrote in layered counterpoint, built emotional swells with stacked vocals, and pieced together arrangements with obsessive precision. Brian was hearing stuff nobody else was hearing. He'd walk in, sit at the piano, and within seconds, we were in his world, drummer Hal Blaine says.
Brian obviously was chomping at the bit to grow, not unlike the Beatles with Revolver and Rubber Soul.
November of '65, at my house in Beverly Hills, my friend goes, I want you to listen to this album by the Beatles. And I got so blown out that I went to the piano and started writing songs, started making melodies.
Have you heard Rubber Soul, man?
Yeah, I've heard it.
Oh, I want to do an album like this, where the whole thing's the gas, all good stuff, with like a theme, you know? 45 singles, that's over. This is where it's at now, man.
I wanted to try to top it. I felt competitive with the Beatles. You know, it's a funny thing, it's funny, but I felt competitive with them.
Here is Mr. Phil Spector.
There was an energy that Philip would get. I remember Philip would be so excited about every session. There was just a vitality in the room that would lift you off of your feet. And also, there'd be so many players and the sound would be so huge. I mean, it was definitely that wall of sound was really there.
Philip had his wall of sound. Every producer in town used to come by to peek in because they knew that the word was like wildfire. Phil Spector's recording, usually Friday nights. Brian Wilson used to come around once in a while to the Spector sessions. We didn't really know who he was. They were trying to learn what the magic dust Phil Spector was sprinkling on records.
Everybody had to go to the wall of sound, but it took me forever. Ask Brian Wilson what it's like to get the Spector around. I mean, I was his Dr. Moriarty, you know, his mentor.
The sweetness of Brian Wilson's productions hid a fiercely competitive nature. and he constantly measured his work against that of the most famous producer of the day.
Phil Spector, he was everything. There's nothing to compare. He was it. The biggest inspiration of my whole life.
He thought he was in a race with me. I was never in a race with him. I always wondered how it took two people to write Little Deuce Coupe, you know, or Make Good Vibrations, which is an edit record, with all due respect. It's not a great record. It's an edit record made with some weird instrument, but it's got a lot of edits in it. It's like Psycho is a great film, but it's an edit film. Without edits, it's not a film. With edits, it's a great film.
He used to use a bunch of musicians that were really, really ahead of their time, really good players. So I used them for Pet Sounds. I wanted to take the wall of sound and do my own thing with it and try a new wall of sound.
He wanted the Wrecking Crew guys, and that's how I got involved.
I said to him, I want this to be as good as Phil Spector's records. And they all started laughing, And I said, no, I'm serious. I want it to be as good as Phil Spector.
In the summer of '65, a folk tune from the Bahamas made its way into California's pop music scene. That song was Sloop John B, a traditional island folk song turned Beach Boys anthem, blending island vibes with American rock and roll. Originally called Sloop John B Sails, the song had already been recorded by others like the Kingston Trio in '58. But it was Al Jardine, a big fan of folk music, who really pushed for the Beach Boys to take it on.
Al Jardine came to me. He said, would you like to try to do Sloop John B in a Beach Boys style? And he played the Kingston Trio's version. And I took down the chords of the song, and I went into my piano room and wrote an arrangement of it. Just like that. I said, I love it, Al, I love it. He goes, I can't wait to hear it. And he goes in the studio, he goes, Brian, you've done it again, you've done it again.
Brian had his own vision for the song, saying, I wanted to create a sound that was lush and layered, something that would stand out. He even made a few lyrical tweaks, changing, this is the worst trip since I've been born, to, this is the worst trip I've ever been on, and I feel so break up, to, I feel so broke up, and broke up the people's trunk, to, broke in the captain's trunk. That first line change has even been read as a possible wink to the psychedelic scene of the time. He utilized a 4-track recorder for the initial backing tracks, then transferred them to an 8-track recorder for overdubs. The Beatles used to do that as well for their arrangements. This method, known as ping-pong recording or bouncing down, involved bouncing multiple tracks onto a single track, allowing for more complex arrangements. But this technique limited the ability to create a true stereo mix at the time, as well as took intensive time to actually perform in the recording studio, and also would lower sound quality with each successive bounce down. And what the Beatles didn't have on their hands while recording was some of the best musicians in the world, which Brian had through the Wrecking Crew. These were seasoned session players: Hal Blaine, Carol Kaye, Glenn Campbell, and Tommy Tedesco, to name a few, the invisible architects behind hundreds of 60s hits. Where the Beatles evolved by playing together as a tight, self-contained unit, Brian operated like a maestro. He didn't need the rest of the Beach Boys in the studio, not at first. He could build words with these musicians, painting in layers of sound that few others could even imagine.
First of all, most of the rock and rollers are very nice that we worked for, but we always had to invent lines for them. But with Brian, no, he brought in his own music.
See, I would write the music on paper, on music paper. And I go in and I say, here's your paper, here's your paper, here's your paper, here's your paper, here's your paper. And they all read the notes on the paper together.
While the Beatles were still exploring the limits of 4-track recording at Abbey Road, Brian was conducting sessions across LA with up to 20 musicians all at once, all synced with military-like precision. And yet the music that emerged was anything but mechanical. Brian once said, "I felt like a little kid making my own toy world." For the vocals, Brian auditioned everyone in the band one by one to see who'd sing lead. Al thought he had it in the bag since it was his idea to begin with, but nope. Brian lined us up one at a time to try out for the lead vocal. I had naturally assumed that I would sing the lead since I had brought in the arrangement. It was like interviewing for a job. Pretty funny. He didn't like any of us. My vocal had a much more mellow approach because I was bringing it from the folk idiom. For the radio, we needed a more rock approach. Brian and Mike ended up singing it. They even shot a music video for Top of the Pops in the UK, directed by Derek Taylor. Yes, the same guy who worked with the Beatles. It was filmed at Brian's house, with Dennis acting as the cameraman. Sloop John B came out as a single on March 21st, 1966 in the US and April 15th in the UK. Backed with You're So Good to Me, it hit number 3 in the Billboard charts and stayed there for 11 weeks. It was a worldwide hit, and still one of the Beach Boys' most beloved songs. But here's the thing. Sloop John B doesn't really fit with the rest of Pet Sounds. It's the only song not written by Brian. The album is full of introspective, emotional tracks about identity, heartbreak, and growing up. This song is a lively, kind of chaotic tale about a guy stuck on a boat who just wants to go home. It's more like their earlier surf rock days. Funnier, lighter, and more story-driven. Critics have pointed out how much of a shift it is tonally. Brian wasn't totally sure about including it either at first, but he came around when he saw how it could work for the album as a whole. In a 1998 interview, he said, "No, I wanted it to be a single, but when they said album, I said fine. That was okay with me. I said it would help the album. You know, it would help it sell, and it would fit perfectly." So, yeah, maybe it doesn't match the emotional depth of songs like Caroline No or I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, but it gave the album a jolt of energy and fans something familiar to hold on to. And from a commercial standpoint, it worked.
And of course, at that time, remember that we were adults, maybe approaching 30, 31 years old, and these kids were 16, 17-year-old kids singing about surfing. And what the heck did we know about surfing? So in the beginning, this was very infantile music to us. So when Brian all of a sudden started singing these falsetto things, we thought, what is this? What is he doing? I mean, it was impossible.
Well, the first time I saw Brian, he was a very young man. But something was different, though, about him because I noticed that everybody respected him a lot. And so word got out among us studio musicians because we talk about the people that we worked with.
I want everyone to forget about surf music, just go to a whole other dimension. I need someone to bounce ideas off of and help me with some of the words. You got away with words. I got a good feeling about you that time you played for me, and I get these good feelings, see? And I gotta go with them. If I don't, bad things happen.
Hi, Larry. This is Mike Love of the Beach Boys. We'd like to thank you for playing all our records in the past.
Brian Wilson.
Shut up, Brian. We'd like to thank you, Larry, for playing all the Beach Boys records in the past, especially our new one.
Wilson.
Cool it. Al the Gong.
It all starts with religion, Brian said in one 1966 interview that went on to connect his sense of faith to the way that he would transform his feelings into beautiful sounds. A lot of songs are the results of emotional experiences. Sadness, pain. I find it possible to spill melodies, beautiful melodies, in moments of great despair. This is one of the wonderful things about this art form. But if Brian had one weakness as a songwriter, he felt, it was expressing his emotions verbally. And though his songs almost always revolved around his feelings and ideas, he most often depended upon collaborators to transform his simply stated notions into lyrics. Better yet, Brian's collaborators served as a sounding board, not just for his musical ideas, but for all the other whims and fancies that careen through his mind. And the more that he began to think about the new album, the more Brian understood that he would need a new partner to help write the new songs. Someone who was articulate and sensitive, who had nothing to do with his family or any previous Beach Boys record. Talking one day with Lauren Schwartz, Brian was reminded of Tony Asher, a youngish advertising executive he'd seen at the evening parties in his friend's Hollywood apartment. Interestingly, Asher, who wrote jingles for the Carson Scott advertising agency, including spots from Mattel and Gallo Wine, and had often recorded them at Western Recorders, had actually introduced Brian to Lauren back in January 1963. Asher was an urbane, well-to-do bachelor who was well-read and preferred jazz to rock.
When we first began to work, Brian said, I want to do something unlike anything the Beach Boys have ever done before, so don't think in terms of past Beach Boys songs. He told me that the real problem was that I think they were something like a year late with the album, or many months late with the album, and needed to turn out a lot of songs in a short period of time, and everybody that he had written with before was out of the country. The boys were in Japan, I think.
Aside from the prestige, aside from the fact that the guy is like one of my idols, Asher told David Leaf in 1978, that was like someone saying, how would you like $25,000? Securing a 3-week leave of absence from his bosses at Carson Scott, Asher packed up some yellow legal pads and pencils and drove up to Brian's house in Beverly Hills to begin his unexpected, exciting task. What Brian had in mind for the new album, Asher recalls, had nothing to do with the Beatles or any kind of rock and roll. Brian defined it as wanting to do something closer to classical American love songs, like Cole Porter or Rodgers and Hammerstein, he says. Brian asked Asher what his favorite songs were, and when it turned out that the Beach Boy hadn't even heard the romantic jazz ballad Stella by Starlight, Asher sat down at the piano and played it for him. He was totally blown away. Most days, Asher would go to Brian's house at about 10 a.m., only to wait for his partner to rouse himself from bed and get something to eat. That could take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, during which they'd start chatting about whatever was on their minds. We'd have, like, a 2 or 3 hour conversation that set the mood, Asher says. We'd ramble on about whatever. Girls we'd dated, relationships we'd had, heartbreak, and so on. And then we'd write within that mood.
Essentially, it was a collaborative experience, which is to say that Brian was composing melodies at the same time that I was composing lyrics, and we would stand he'd be sitting at the piano and I'd be standing with a legal pad writing lyrics as they came to me.
We were thinking about back when you're just beginning to understand what love is, acknowledging that it's immature but still universal. Brian clearly fed off of the emotional intensity he recalled from those early relationships, which may be why he didn't seem to recognize their inherent immaturity, or, for that matter, what his fascination with them said about the state of his grown-up relationship with Marilyn. As Asher recalls, he was constantly looking at teenage girls, which wasn't like a 47-year-old looking at teenagers. Brian was 23. But he thought that they were all the most beautiful girls in the world, and he was married at the time, so it was fairly obvious he was confused about love. As Asher recalls, Brian's mood could swing in a moment from bright-eyed and happy to bitterly depressed. He would spend hours avoiding work, sometimes leading up from the piano to watch an episode of Flipper, or bursting into tears when Sandy, the young boy, learned a touching lesson about life from his finny friend. The hours at the piano ran smoothly, with Brian moving confidently to incorporate an entirely new vocabulary of melodic and structural ideas into his songs.
When you write with someone at the piano, you always wonder, if you're a lyricist, you always wonder what they're really hearing in their head, because what they play on the piano is limited by how well they can duplicate what they're hearing in their head. And what I didn't know, of course, was what kinds of things Brian was hearing. That was one of the things that was so exciting about hearing the final mixes and the final recordings, because all of these string, flute, other instrument things, I never heard because they were in Brian's head, but I wasn't privy to that.
They worked quickly, sometimes moving from a general idea and a few stray melodic fragments to an all but completed song in less than half an hour. At the same time that Brian told a reporter that all music starts with religion, he told his old friend Bruce Griffin that pop music would inevitably become more spiritual in the coming years. I simply believe in the power of the spirit, and the manifestation of this is in the goodness of people, he said. And to Brian, whose experiments with marijuana and LSD had given him a visceral sense of sacred experience, music was an expression of spirituality. It was his own new world, his city on a hill, his western frontier. When I was making Pet Sounds, I did have a dream about a halo over my head, but people couldn't see it, he said in a 1996 interview. God was right there with me. I could feel that feeling in my head, in my brain.
I said, well, Mike, I'm running with another collaborator. He goes, what? Another collaborator? He says, I thought I was your collaborator. I said, well, for this one album, Tony Asher's my collaborator. And he understood. He was just a very cool person with a cool attitude, the right kind of attitude for me to work with. He wasn't egotistical. He wasn't outgoing and braggadocio kind of person. He's like a cool, laid-back kind of person. No, I don't like Mike Love at all. No.
Why is that wrong?
Because I don't like his attitude is too egotistical. Can't be around the guy. 5 minutes around him, that's all I can take.
Ultimately, I think the Beach Boys meant so much to so many people because of the positivity, and that was me. Brian was melancholy. I was Mr. Positive Thinker. So I complimented Brian's melancholy with my upbeatness.
Tony was a little more meticulous. Mike was real spontaneous, you know.
And it seemed to work very well. I mean, it just flowed. We sort of buoyed each other up, and I mean, he was always very supportive and complimentary about what I was doing, and I was genuinely just knocked out by the things he was doing. So it was fun. We just sat and said, wow, that's great, try this, do that.
You Still Believe in Me actually started out as a totally different song called In My Childhood.
You Still Believe in Me was the first thing I wrote. Brian already had a track for that. He didn't ever play me the original lyric. It was recorded, I guess, with a lyric, In My Childhood. He picked out the melody on the piano, which was then recorded over that track, and I went home and wrote the lyric to that melody.
It reminds me of a little child, the child in me. I know perfectly well. That's just the kid in me wanted to come out and play. I was trying to capture the innocence of childhood, the best I could. So was Tony. He tried to get the lyrics to inspire the little kids.
The little horn that you hear honking at the end of You Still Believe in Me was actually put on in the recording session that was done for In My Childhood. And the idea behind that was that apparently at the end, there's a bicycle bell as well, I think, although I don't know if you can hear it. And it was just all the sounds of a person's childhood that Brian added. And it wasn't possible to get that out because they'd been mixed in with the track.
In a 1996 interview, Brian described the song as a little boys' choir type song with me doing the soprano. Very, very spiritual. It's sung from the point of view of someone who knows that they've screwed up, but feels grateful to have a partner who still believes in them. The singer admits he's not where I should be, and has let his partner down, even though he's trying. So the strength of the relationship really depends on the other person's patience and maturity. Brian once explained that it's about a man who isn't afraid to express love in a way that might be seen as more feminine. He told an interviewer, You Still Believe in Me was more of what I would call a man who would not be afraid to take all of his clothes off and sing like a girl because he had feelings for people from that perspective. I was able to close my eyes and go into a world and sing a little bit more effeminately and more sweetly, which allows a lot more love to come down through me. You know what I mean? Even Paul McCartney singled this track out as one of his favorites. In a 1990 interview, he said, I love that melody. That kills me, that melody. That's my favorite, I think. The way that's arranged, where it goes away very quietly. I was in the car the other night, and I was telling the kids saying, wait, here it comes. And then it comes back, and it's so beautiful right at the end, coming surging back in these multicolored harmonies. It sends shivers up my spine.
respected that whole idea that he had. You know, we didn't try to destroy it. We were the band and he was the leader.
Brian was firm about what he wanted. He was able to express himself and let you know what you should do, and he was always pretty cool in the studio. Brian wanted the take to be exactly right, and if it was a half hour or an hour over, or if it took another total session, it didn't matter. He would go until he got what he wanted.
Brian, when he was playing the organ, he'd be explaining the same time he was playing, because we weren't recording yet, and he said, I'm gonna, you know, I'll be moving around here, and I would play something, and I would look over there, and he has some good sized hands too. So he knew how to pull the what they call the feet, the bars on the organ, on the B3, and I would be playing something, and he said, "Oh, yeah, stay with that," you know, and then you'd work off each other, you know, and that was made it so much fun.
I don't know, Brian. It's like you're becoming a cross between Rachmaninoff and General Patton.
No, it's worse. He's the Stalin of the studio.
Why don't you sing all the parts yourself, Brian? I can't. It needs those Beach Boys harmonies.
On the surface, Wouldn't It Be Nice sounds like a sugar-coated teenage dream, but listen closely and it reveals a yearning to transcend the limitations of youth, to escape into a world of emotional and physical maturity. Wouldn't it be nice if we were older? Then we wouldn't have to wait so long. And wouldn't it be nice to live together in the kind of world where we belong? This isn't just a line about wanting to grow up. It's about impatience with the confines of adolescence, a frustration that love, in its fullest and most intimate form, is out of reach because of age, circumstance, or societal expectation. Brian revealed, I was just thinking about what it would be like to be in love and married, with the freedom to do what you want, not being held back by parents or school or money. Its writing was deeply personal, inspired by Brian's infatuation with his sister-in-law, Diane Rovell. Tony Asher says he'd stop in the middle of writing a song or a conversation and start going on about Diane, about how innocent, sweet, and beautiful she was. Brian was really just so naive. I'd be thinking, your wife's in the next room and you're talking about her sister? It was about what you can't have, a kind of melancholy optimism. That's what made it more than a teenage love song. It was one of only 2 songs on Pet Sounds where Tony Asher wrote lyrics to a melody that Brian had already written, the other being You Still Believe in Me.
Wouldn't It Be Nice is one of the happiest songs I ever wrote. A very happy song.
Brian just loved the idea of wouldn't it be nice to be a young couple that could do whatever you wanted to do and want to be great when we can.
Tony and I wrote that song for young people who know what it's like to fall in love and be happy and spend the day together and all that, you know. We wanted people to relate to those lyrics.
Wouldn't It Be Nice, Brian played me a little part of the melody, but he hadn't finished it. And so periodically I'd ask him about that, and I'd say, how's that song coming? Or he'd say, let's work on something else. What do you want to work on? And I'd say, what about that song you played me the other day? Oh, I haven't finished that yet. So that continued, and eventually he said to me, okay, now I'm finished. I can play it to you. So he did. He played me the whole thing all the way through, no lyric. Then we began to compose that. I began to write a lyric to it. But because he had completely finished the melody at that point, all he focused on for the first time in our collaboration was my lyric. And he was focusing on absolutely every syllable. And it was terribly difficult for me to write. As you know, there are lots of syllables and lots of words in that lyric because it has so many notes. And about 5 minutes into the process, I said, this is not going to work, because in the past when we wrote together, he had something else to concentrate on, which was writing the melody. But in this case, there was nothing else for him to do. His work was done. So I said, why don't you just play this into a cassette recorder and I'll take it home and write it. And when I brought it back, it was, again, one of those situations where he listened to it and said, it's great.
The lyrics by Tony were really exceptionally good, on that one.
The session was marked by its innovative approach, with the 12-string Mando guitar plugged directly into the recording console, creating the song's distinctive calliope-like intro. Brian said, "I had 2 accordion players playing at once, and it just rang through the room, in the booth, and everyone was saying, 'What is that sound?' I wanted to create a dense, layered sound that enveloped the listener. The use of unconventional instruments and complex harmonies was my way of achieving that."
On Wouldn't It Be Nice, Brian wanted to beef up the end of the phrase, so he had me play ba-bum, ba-bum on the timpani to kind of help beef up what Hal was doing, because Hal was playing a figure there too.
With Hal, sometimes he would be a little headstrong and he wanted to play it his way. So I had a couple arguments with him on Wouldn't It Be Nice. I said, "Look, I'm really looking for more of a boom instead of a boom, boom, you know." And he goes, "Well, what's wrong with this? Boom, boom." And I said, "You're not getting the beat. It's boom, boom, not boom, boom." And he goes, "Oh, I see, I see." That's how it would work.
Some of the sheet music Brian gave the musicians was written in different keys, which threw some of them off. Bassist Lyle Ritz, who was playing in D, thought there had to be a mistake. He said, "The rest of the band was in another key. I knew that was wrong. So during a break, I looked at everyone else's sheet music to see if it was a mistake, because you can't do that. But Brian pulled it off." The vocals took longer to record than any other track on the album. Brian's meticulous nature led to multiple takes, some passages requiring up to 30 attempts. Mike Love says, "We did one passage of Wouldn't It Be Nice close to 30 times, and some of the tries were nearly perfect. But Brian was looking for something more than the actual notes or the blend. He was reaching for something mystical, out of the range of hearing."
The vocal sessions were phenomenal. They were arduous, though.
Well, Brian Wilson, I've always said this for years. He was probably, 23, 24 years old. He had the brilliance of Rachmaninoff and the command power of General Patton.
He was like Stalin or somebody in the studio, the Stalin of the studio.
We re-recorded so many times our vocals for Wouldn't It Be Nice. The rhythm was never right. We would slave at Western here in Hollywood. Then, for a few days singing this thing, and no, it's not right, it's not right.
It was perfect vocally in terms of the notes and the timbre and the quality. But Brian had another idea. I mean, it was some vibration about it. Somebody had an impure thought.
Musicians were delighted with what they were hearing and what they were being asked to do, and Brian was thrilled at their performances. You can hear it when you listen to the session tapes.
Carl says, "Wouldn't It Be Nice" was the track that really brought the hope to all of us. We did at least 10 sessions on that one, and it still wasn't right. I still think we sang it a little rushed. But wait. Why is Mike Love credited as a co-writer? Well, Mike wasn't officially credited for Wouldn't It Be Nice until 1994, when he won a lawsuit for writing credits on 35 Beach Boys songs. During the trial, his lawyer floated the idea that even though Mike wasn't in the room when Brian and Tony were writing the song, maybe Brian called him from the bathroom to get his input. Tony later called that argument absurd. In an interview in '96, when asked what Mike Love contributed to the song, Tony said, "None whatsoever." But under oath, he did admit that Mike may have come up with the line, "Good night, my baby, sleep tight, my baby," and possibly helped a little with the vocal arrangement. So there you go. Wouldn't It Be Nice is about the emotional maturity hiding inside youthful voices. It's not just a teenage crush, it's the prelude to a deeper, more permanent kind of love, but with all the aches of having to wait. Written possibly within a few days of Wouldn't It Be Nice, Caroline No marked a pivotal turning point for Brian, emotionally, creatively, and professionally. Issued under his name in March of '66, it was the first to hint at the deeply introspective and orchestral world of Pet Sounds. Though commercially modest, peaking at number 32 in the US, it's now revered as one of Brian's most emotionally resonant songs.
I was in love with her in high school, and as soon as high school was out, I went to the piano and played a 4 freshman song. And I was thinking about her, and I started crying because I realized I'd never be able to have her. So later on, when Tony and I got together, I thought, Caroline, for Carol. So I wrote it for Carol.
I had heard it as Carol I Know, Carol, comma, I Know, and Brian was hearing it as Caroline Know. That only lasted for a couple of minutes because we decided what it was going to be, but that's kind of an interesting little play on words. And because I don't think I would have written the words Caroline Know. It's not a phrase that I would ever use, but it's so poignant, a phrase to use. Just to say no, like no, don't do that. And it really adds so much to that song, so I think it was a great improvement as it turns out.
The lyrics are spare but cutting. Brian's narrator mourns the emotional distance that has grown between him and a girl who has changed, physically and emotionally. Where did your long hair go? Where is the girl I used to know? This isn't just about a haircut, it's about a loss of purity, sweetness, and emotional accessibility. A deep personal sadness Brian himself was grappling with at the time. It's often reported that Caroline No does not feature additional vocals from the other Beach Boys because they were away on tour and he was in a hurry to complete the record. However, according to biographer Mark Dillon, the relevant documentation suggests that the members were available for recording and could have contributed to the song if Brian had wished. Asher remembered that he never had the impression of it being a Beach Boys song. Unlike the pair's other collaborations, Brian never demonstrated on piano the vocal parts that his bandmates would sing.
I asked Capitol Records to put Caroline No out as a single under the name Brian Wilson because I wanted to promote my name. And they did, and the song didn't make it. The darn thing didn't make it.
If it had, do you think it might have marked the end of the Beach Boys?
Oh no, if it was a hit, I might have released another one, but I'm glad it didn't because I'm glad the Beach Boys kept going. Caroline No, my dad told me to put a speed up on the tape machine, and speed it up about a half a note. And he said, it'll sound sweeter. I said, Dad, I can't do that. He goes, son, look, trust me, try it. You'll love it. I tried it and it worked.
The slowing of the tape added a dreamlike, slightly unreal quality, a sonic metaphor for nostalgia and distortion of memory. Brian later said, I wanted it to sound like crying. The track ends with an evocative and unexpected coda, the sound of a barking dog, Brian's pet, Banana, and a passing train, distant, fading, lonely. The coda idea was highly influential, inspiring the Beatles, and in turn much of the pop music world, to experiment with similar codas on Sgt. Pepper and the White Album. In Marilyn's recollection, everybody at Capitol said it should be a single because it was so good, and there were no background vocals, so they said, why don't we release this as a Brian Wilson single, because it's not really a Beach Boys song. Conversely, biographer Stephen Gaines wrote that Capitol knew it was not a hit, but released the song to encourage Brian to complete the forthcoming album. Asher recalled that the criticism Brian received from his bandmates about the song not being Beach Boys enough was what prompted him to issue the single under his own name. This solo release subtly signaled Brian's growing separation from the rest of the Beach Boys. In a nutshell, it was like he was outgrowing the rest of the band. Tony Asher says, some of the guys in the band didn't understand what Brian was doing. They thought it was too introspective, too far from the Beach Boys image. Brian's decision to release the song under his own name, not the Beach Boys, revealed a desire for creative independence. It was the first visible crack in the group's cohesion, highlighting tensions between Brian's increasingly ambitious artistic vision and the rest of the band's focus on accessibility and group identity. These creative differences would intensify during the Smile sessions, when Brian pushed even farther into experimental territory. I Know There's an Answer is one of the most conflicted and revealing tracks on Pet Sounds, written by Brian and road manager Terry Sachen. Tony Asher recalls, Brian startled me one afternoon by saying, "Oh, listen, I just wrote a song with Terry." I listened to it and said to myself, "You mean I'm not writing all the songs on the album?" I didn't feel betrayed. I was just surprised. What began as a deeply personal, and for some controversial, reflection on ego and identity became a public sign of the internal divisions forming within the Beach Boys during their most ambitious period. Brian was inspired to write the song following his experience with LSD. Explaining Terry's background, Schwartz wrote that Terry had met with Brian through his younger cousins. Terry ingratiated himself with Brian by supplying him with marijuana and hashish and tempting him with other substances. It was initially conceived as Hang On to Your Ego, a commentary on how drug use and the shedding of one's ego could profoundly alter perception. Tony Asher says, Brian was thinking about how people create artificial boundaries for themselves. The instrumentation was just wild, and you could feel the emotional tug-of-war going on. Brian actually recorded the vocals with the original Hang On to Your Ego lyric, and this version is available as a bonus track on the album's 1990 CD reissue. LSD first became a widely available street drug by early 1965. 3 of the Beatles, John, George, and Ringo, had their first acid trips by this same period, for example. Brian was fascinated by the drug at the time, having had what he called a religious experience on the occasion that he used it, but was less enamored with many of the so-called acid heads. His 2016 memoir states of the song, "People took acid to get away from themselves, but that wasn't the right way to take it. It was supposed to make you go deeper into yourself. I wanted to remind people that they could survive everything best if they remembered who they were." The subject matter was slightly unusual for rock music at that time, and Mike did not like the original lyrics and refused to sing them. He later said, "I wasn't comfortable with the LSD references. I told Brian I'm not singing that." It just didn't sit right aware of the fact that Brian had experimented with LSD and knew that the prevailing drug jargon suggested that doses of LSD would shatter your ego, as if that were a positive thing. I wasn't interested in taking acid or getting rid of my ego. He said, "The people that I'd seen indulge in those things exhibited behaviors and mannerisms that left much to be desired." Mike wants to talk about people who have behaviors that leave much to be desired. Al Jardine recalled that Brian was very concerned and asked the rest of the band for their opinions. To be honest, I don't think we even knew what an ego was. Finally, Brian decided, forget it, I'm changing the lyrics. There's too much controversy. It's funny. Now it seems like no big deal. It just seemed like it at the time. Mike said that Brian didn't balk at his proposed lyric changes. Maybe he cared, maybe he didn't. He never said anything to me directly. In a 2007 interview, Brian said that he didn't mind changing the lyrics. But you know what? The ego of the band was Mike. He was the ego guy. The result? A compromise. Mike rewrote a couple of lines that he had issues with. Terry also helped revise the lyrics, transforming the song's central message from a critique of ego loss into a broader appeal for personal clarity and truth. In the verses, "How can I come on when I know I'm guilty?" was replaced with, "How can I come on and tell them the way that they live could be better?" In the chorus, "Hang on to your ego, hang on, but I know that you're going to lose the fight," was changed to, "I know there's an answer, I know, but I have to find it by myself." Personally speaking, I do think the rewrite sounds better, but hey, that's just me. And despite concerns over the drug references, the key line, "They trip through the day and waste all their thoughts at night," was kept.
No, I think what the bad blood came from is because there were certain people involved in Brian's life who were into things like heroin and a lot of acid, and Brian got completely out there, and that was a drag because then he got to the point where he was not able to function.
Catatonic?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
And it severely impaired his ability to be as creative in a commercial sense that he once was. He was still creative in an abstract, incoherent way, which
wouldn't be accessible to the general public.
Well, he couldn't finish anything he started, and so that's.
Do you not think the drugs can exacerbate any kind of mental turmoil that's in there? Do you think it did with him?
Oh, absolutely.
And as he went further.
No, what it did is it pushed him from functional to dysfunctional psychotic behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because as the doctor once explained to me, is that there are alcoholics who do fine if they don't drink, but if they drink, it screws them up. They can't function. And that's Brian. He was real sensitive that way, and I think the drugs pushed him over the line.
Marijuana helped me write Pet Sounds.
It's strange how your mind works when you're under pressure, Tony Asher reveals. Sometimes you can't write the lyrics that express what you feel, so you write a song about not saying anything. The idea was that sometimes it's better not to talk, that being close, physically and emotionally, says more than words ever could. Brian thought that Don't Talk had an overall mood similar to his 1963 song, Lonely Sea, saying, it's a different setting, but the emotion is the same. His wife, Marilyn, said that the lyrics demonstrated Brian was at his most romantic, and that other people would have thought the message was sissy-ish, but he was very romantic, and that was just coming from two people just being close. In reference to the line, "Listen to my heartbeat," Brian reflected, I felt very deeply about that line. I have to say I'm proud of it. The innocence of youth in my voice, of being young and childlike. I think that's what people liked. I wanted to sing it alone. It was a personal song, and I thought the harmonies would take away from the intimacy. It was the only string-only arrangement on Pet Sounds, and marked Brian's first attempt at orchestrating strings without help from an outside arranger. The lush string lines and subtle organ create a sense of stillness and melancholy. Record producer Phil Ramone said of the song, though Brian might not have studied Brahms or Ravel, he heard them in his head. This is evident in these chords and the way that they were voiced. It was unusual for pop music at the time. Tony Asher remembered that he was literally speechless when he heard the completed track. He reflected, I always thought this song was one hell of an example of Brian's musical sophistication. I never realized that Brian had that kind of talent for serious arranging before I heard this recording. It may be the most beautiful thing Brian ever recorded, Paul McCartney said about the track. I mean, what better praise could you possibly hope for? Over the years, Don't Talk has been covered by artists ranging from Linda Ronstadt to Elvis Costello and remains a staple for fans and musicians who regard Pet Sounds as a masterpiece of pop innovation.
Now, you also wrote a lot of really melancholy songs.
Yes.
And on Pet Sounds, for instance, you have a wonderful song. I wasn't made for these times.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering if you were ever felt reluctant to expose that part of yourself to your listeners.
In Pet Sounds?
Mm-hmm. Well, especially songs like that, those feeling out of place type songs.
Yeah, I did that because lyrically, I did feel kind of like, I felt like a little Bob Dylan, you know, but Bob Dylan was a message man with lyrics too, you know? And I kind of was a spokesman for the Beach Boys. I had turned into a legitimate artist in my own right. And it was a very new, kind of a newfound power for me, right? If you ever experienced a newfound power, a mental power, you say, well, wait a minute, man, I'm way smarter than I used to be. You know, and like some kind of an awareness or something, you know? That kind of thing goes on a lot in my life.
When you wrote I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, was that how you were feeling?
When I wrote that, it was like a thing of, I really was feeling that way. Yes, I was, because I felt that I was being rejected by some of my friends, you know?
For what?
Who knows? You know, I just felt a rejection from the public. You know, I can't explain it, you know, any more than that. It was a very super personal thing. It was a personal thing that I cannot really go into because it's too deep, you know?
Well, I want to play some of that song. And this is from your 1966 album, Pet Sounds, which is really one of the legendary albums in
in the history of
in the history of rock and roll.
Yes.
Yeah. And do you want to say anything else about what you were feeling when you wrote this?
Sure. I felt I had prayer sessions with my brother Carl, and we both prayed for people's safety and well-being. And we made this album with the fact that love was going to be the predominant theme in the album, with, of course, artistic and entertaining kind of music going on at the same time. But the love came from the voices that we did, and we just got into a little trip where we were going to bring some spiritual love to the world, you know. And we really did, you know, we actually did, because we wanted to in our souls, you know. We both felt the calling, you know, so why not pray for this album and nurture it along and pray and have prayer sessions, you know. So it was very religious. It was a religious experience, like taking, some people think that psychedelic drugs are a religious experience, you know. And that's how I felt about, of course, about Pet Sounds.
Okay, so from Pet Sounds, this is Brian Wilson's I Just Wasn't Made for These Times.
Tony said, Brian was really saying, I can't relate to the people around me. I can't find people who understand what I'm trying to do. Tony felt that the writing was different from their other collaborations. He continues, in many of the other songs, when Brian would express a feeling, I would say, oh, yes, I've had those feelings. Maybe not in the same way or to the same degree, but I understood them. But this one, I didn't relate to. He never asked me to interpret his feelings in one of our songs, and certainly not this one. On another occasion, he revealed the song evolved from a discussion he had with Brian about the fact that neither one of us was a particularly popular kid in high school. The lyrics describe an artist struggling to find his place in the world. Sometimes I feel very sad, while expressing a longing for a time or world where his ideas might be better understood. The repeated line, I just wasn't made for these times, is both a lament as well as a bold declaration of individuality. Brian's desire to push musical boundaries was not always embraced by the rest of the band, or Capitol Records, further fueling the song's theme of alienation. Carol Kay says, Brian liked to layer things in ways that no one else would think to do. You'd have a harpsichord, but also a tack piano, and then a bass harmonica. It was all about color. Most notably, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times features the first use of a theremin-like instrument in a pop song, an electro-theremin played by Paul Tanner. The eerie wailing sound enters the track subtly at first, but then reappears throughout the song, helping to underscore the mood of alienation and otherworldliness. I wanted that sound to be like a cry, a feeling that came from deep inside, Brian said. The vocal arrangement is one of Brian's most complex, and all 6 Beach Boys sing here. Brian sang the lead vocal himself and layered it with multiple overdubbed harmonies, all sung in different registers and phrasing. The blend of baritone and falsetto parts creates a swirling, almost psychedelic atmosphere that was ahead of its time. In addition to multiple vocal counterpoints, the chorus features Spanish-sung backing vocals, O cuando seré, un día seré. When will I be? One day I will be. The song is in B-flat major, but its harmony is unusually complex for 1960s pop. Brian modulates frequently, with chromatic bass movement and jazz-influenced chords that add to the feeling of emotional instability. The use of non-diatonic chord changes, particularly the transitions between major and minor tonalities, reflects the conflict expressed in the lyrics. I Just Wasn't Made for These Times remains a profound statement of artistic isolation and a cornerstone of Brian Wilson's legacy, not just as a pop craftsman, but as one of the most emotionally honest composers of his era. Most of the basic tracks were finished by February 9th, when the rest of the Beach Boys, now back from Asia and ready to record, began overdubbing their vocals, at which point the atmosphere took a definite turn. Tony, for one, got the distinct feeling that his lyrics were not being greeted with open arms. All those guys in the band, certainly Al, Dennis, and Mike, were constantly saying, "What the f*** do these words mean?" or "This isn't our kind of shit," he remembers. Brian had comebacks, though. He'd say, "Oh, you guys can't hack this," or "You can't remember your parts." But I remember thinking that those were tense sessions, and I remember thinking, being here isn't good for my mental health. Perhaps Mike's feelings had been hurt because Brian had ditched him, yet again, for another lyricist. Maybe he had grown so accustomed to seeing the audiences go wild for the songs about hot rods, surfboards, and beach bunnies, that this new batch of more mature songs sounded like the musical equivalent of Bankruptcy, which just a few years ago had all but sent his family to the poorhouse. Asher's lyrics, with their candid expressions of vulnerability and sadness, struck Mike as nauseating and offensive. Titled by Mike, or possibly Carl, depending on whom you ask, the album came in a sleeve dominated by a large photo of the boys, dressed for a California winter day in coats and sweaters, beating apple slices to goats. An odd illustration for any non-agrarian project, but weirder still coming from a rock group who ordinarily posed around sunlit beaches or gleaming hot rods. I don't know, Mike. I feel like that may have been more damaging to the brand than any of the lyrics.
And what about the Pet Sounds album? Were you not critical of that, saying it was Brian's ego music?
Capitol Records was.
Were they? Did nobody in the band say that was just Brian's ego music?
No, I don't think so.
No complaints that at that point it was mostly musicians who played and
No,
the band?
It was great because we were out on tour making a lot of money. We'd come back and you'd have some great songs ready.
To just dub your voices on?
Yeah, we didn't, well, that's what we do technically, yeah, but we did like 30 takes, and wouldn't it be nice to get it right? So we
meticulous
we're very meticulous.
Construction.
You hear the harmonies, it's better than anybody in the business when it comes to execution on those records.
But did anyone in the band feel this should be us playing too? I mean, there is that.
I think there is an emotional thing about if you're a musician, think that you can play. And Carl would play in a lot of the sessions when he was available. I don't play anything noteworthy, so I didn't care about that. But I'd like to write lyrics and stuff. And conceptually, I've been involved with some very big hits and stuff.
So is that another myth that the Beach Boys kind of musically were really only Brian's backup vocalist from that point onwards, or more often that?
Kinda. That would be fair to say.
And nobody objects to that role?
No, because he was a gifted musical genius. Nobody else was to that degree in the band.
Nobody else in the band had that kind of vision musically.
Yeah, exactly. Ability.
Right, so you were all happy to kind of contribute on an artistic level to that concept.
As the Beach Boys finished tracking vocals in the spring of '66, Brian was already thinking bigger. Much bigger. Brian shares, "I said, let's do something completely different. Let's do a pocket symphony." That song was Good Vibrations. It began in early February of 1966, weeks before most of Pet Sounds had even been recorded. The original version of Good Vibrations was simpler. Guitars, drums, and a fairly standard structure. Brian confessed, "I knew it could be something really special. I had a lot of unfinished ideas. Fragments of music I called feels. Each feel represented a mood or an emotion I'd felt, and I planned to fit them together like a mosaic." Similarly, he aimed for Good Vibrations to surpass Phil Spector's writing and production on the Righteous Brothers' 1964 hit, You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin'. Tony Asher recalls, "Brian played for me a bunch of chords that would become Good Vibrations. He didn't have a title for it. Initially, Brian had only the basic chorus and the phrase, 'I get vibes, I get good vibes.' He proposed the title Good Vibes, but Tony felt it sounded trendy and lightweight, suggesting Good Vibrations instead. Tony also crafted the chorus lyrics into good, 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 good vibrations, and wrote many more words for the verses. Tony's version features the lines, "She's already working on my brain. I only looked in her eyes, but I picked up something I just can't explain." And the second verse, "It's weird how she comes in so strong, and I wonder what she's picking up from me." But Brian wasn't satisfied with Tony's version, and it was ultimately discarded in favor of a new set of lyrics penned by Mike, his old collaborator. After some delay, Mike completed the lyrics to Good Vibrations on August 24, 1966, during a 20-minute drive to the studio. He contributed lines for the verses and the chorus hook, "I'm picking up good vibrations, she's giving me excitations." A Capitol Records memo dated February 23, 1966, indicated plans to include the song, then titled Good, 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 Good Vibrations, on Pet Sounds. But by March 3rd, the song remained unfinished, and Brian decided to remove it from the album, to the disappointment of his bandmates. Al recalled that Brian instead delivered Sloop John B after Capitol had requested a hit single for the album. Al considered it to be a big mistake, a view shared by Bruce and Mike, who believed including Good Vibrations would have increased sales of Pet Sounds. But it just wasn't ready. Brian knew the song needed more. He halted work on it, feeling the early versions didn't match the evolving musical complexity he was developing with his masterpiece. He wanted to push it further, beyond anything the band had done before. Pet Sounds is deeply introspective, melancholic, and emotionally cohesive. Good Vibrations, with its shifting sections, experimental structure, and spiritual optimism, would have disrupted that emotional arc. It's really a bridge between Pet Sounds and Smile. An upside-down bridge, smiling at you. Brian viewed it as a separate artistic statement, and it was already growing into something larger than a single album track. Unlike the rest of Pet Sounds, which was recorded in a relatively focused time frame, Good Vibrations became a laboratory for modular recording. Brian recorded over 90 hours of tape in 17 sessions across 4 different studios, something he had never done before. That level of experimentation needed time, and he was unwilling to rush it just to include it on the album. As it so happened, Good Vibrations ultimately became their biggest hit when it was released in October of 1966.
So when you're thinking a melody, you wait. It comes out of you without really designing it, does it?
Well, at times it's almost an unconscious thing, you know.
Yeah.
I believe that songwriting is an unconscious thing. I don't think that anybody can really concentrate on music and write music. I think it comes from a higher place in your mind. I'm almost sure of that. I can almost bet on it.
It comes from the heart.
It comes from the heart. It's like your heart writes the music. Your brain, you can see these keys and you can relate to how the different chords relate to each other. But I think the real music being made comes from your heart. Yeah.
Brian once said, "I think God Only Knows is the best thing I've ever written. It's probably the best I've ever produced, too. The melody was very classical sounding. It came from deep in my soul." Brian said he wanted to write a song with spiritual overtones, but not be religious, Tony Asher adds. "We were trying to find a way to say, 'I love you,' without saying those exact words." The result was one of pop's most emotionally resonant songs, unusual in its frankness and emotional vulnerability. Brian said he was inspired by the Four Freshmen's vocal harmonies and Bach's contrapuntal style. Opening with the striking line, "I may not always love you," the song risks alienating the listener in its first breath. But this moment of uncertainty is immediately flipped, becoming a declaration of absolute devotion. I like the idea of starting a love song with, "I may not always love you." It was such a surprise. People just weren't writing that kind of lyric. Asher and Brian walk a lyrical tightrope, expressing both fear and faith. The phrase, "God only knows what I'd be without you," becomes the emotional centerpiece, a line of complete surrender to love, yet tinged with an existential dread. Though the title includes the word God, Capitol Records was reportedly hesitant about it. It was rare at the time to mention God in a pop song that wasn't overtly religious. Asher said that he and Brian had lengthy conversations about the lyric because unless you were Kate Smith and you were singing God Bless America, no one thought you could say God in a song. He said, "We'll just never get any airplay." Brian's then wife, Marilyn, says, "The first time I heard it, Brian played it for me at the piano, and I went, oh my God, he's talking about God in a record." It was pretty daring to me. And it was another time I thought to myself, oh boy, he's really taking a chance. I thought it was almost too religious, too square.
God Only Knows took me and Tony about an hour to write. It came very fast. It came just like that. And he and I were both astonished with it. We said, we have a classic song on our hands here. And I almost got tears. I mean, it was like a beautiful tune that we had written together, you know.
I never gave any thought to who would actually, sing lead on what song. The only exception to that I recall is that when we were writing God Only Knows, I can remember Brian at some point saying, Carl's going to sing this and it's going to be fantastic.
God Only Knows is a beautiful song. It's just...
I walked into God Only Knows and I went, something wonderful is going on. That's when I realized what Carl kept telling me about how Pet Sounds was going to come to life and what it was going to be, but I didn't understand it till I walked into too many people in too small of a place playing God Only Knows with everything leaking into the other mics and causing this wonderful sound to happen.
Well, the music does have a spiritual quality to it, and it's something that we were aware of when we would do the sessions because you'd hear all the sound coming out, and it was just an indescribable thing that it did to the environment.
Remembering the writing of God Only Knows, Brian acknowledged that he himself had not written that kind of song before, and explained, "I think Tony had a musical influence on me somehow. After about 10 years, I started thinking about it deeper, and I remember him talking about the 1944 standard, Stella by Starlight, and he had a certain love for classic songs." Asher agreed that he felt that he'd inspired Brian to write the song. Brian's 1991 memoir states that the melody for God Only Knows was derived from a John Sebastian song I had been listening to. When presented with this information, Asher and Sebastian said they weren't aware of such a connection. Biographer Mark Dillon suggested that Brian's inspiration would likely have been from the vocal layering on You Didn't Have to Be So Nice, a recent hit by Sebastian's band, The Loving Spoonful.
God Only Knows has always been one of my favorite Beach Boys songs. I wanted to strip it down and look at its components. This is always the best way to hear the raw material of the melody.
Who's Carl alone?
I'll make you so
We got
sure.
two tracks. One track,
God only knows what I'd be without you.
the other track. Together? What Brian had done was to write a beautiful song full of unusual changes and then devise a tapestry of sounds to enhance it. But you see, this is what amazes me. You must have had a kind of blueprint in your mind before you went in the studio. What you were going to
Arrangement-wise, but not sound-wise.
Right.
I couldn't think in my head before I got to what it would sound like until I got there.
No, sure. That will come with the studio work. But
Yeah.
you must have had the plan there of all the harmonies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Working out.
Lead vocals were given to Carl, whose tender delivery is one of the song's most cherished aspects. Brian continues, "I think Carl sang it better than I ever could have. The French horn intro just came to me. It sounded like a classical thing, and I knew it would grab people right away." Mark Dillon suggests that Brian may have changed his mind on the lead vocal partly to address concerns over the large percentage of singing roles he was granting to himself for the album. Though released as the B-side to Wouldn't It Be Nice, God Only Knows gained critical acclaim and eventually became recognized as one of the greatest pop songs ever written. Paul McCartney once called it his favorite song of all time. God Only Knows is one of the few songs that reduces me to tears every time I hear it. It's just a love song, but it's brilliantly done. John Lennon, according to Rolling Stone co-founder Jan Wenner, said he really dug the song. It's the most beautiful song I've ever heard. Perfect in every way, Eric Clapton adds. Bono remarked that the string arrangement was fact and proof of angels. It stands as a testament to Brian's genius, not only for its harmonic sophistication and innovative production, but for the emotional rawness at its core, the fragile, open-hearted expression of love, fear, and dependency.
When they heard the tracks, they didn't like it, because it wasn't surf music anymore, you know? It was like a notch up, a step up in creativity.
Record companies never want to take risks. They want to repeat the formula. And good artists don't do that. Good artists look for something new every time and try and build on what they had before. And so you don't listen to record companies. And you don't listen to frightened members of the band.
I thought they'd like it. I thought they would really like it a lot. I mean, I was disappointed. Mike is the one who didn't like it the most.
He never was critical of what it was. He was just saying it wasn't right for the Beach Boys. And he was very aware of what he referred to as the formula.
They thought it was a little bit too arty and a little bit too much explorative in music.
They were saying this is not like what we've done before, so he saw that as a kind of a validation.
I told the guys, I said, look, we're going to go through this. We're going to get this done, you know. We're going to go through it and we're going to get it done.
When Pet Sounds released on May 16, 1966, it didn't sound like anything else on the radio. It was introspective, melancholy, and heartbreakingly honest. The lyrics spoke of longing and isolation. The music was lush, but sometimes weird. For some fans, and even some members of the band, it felt like Brian had taken a sharp left turn into something unfamiliar. Mike said, "I didn't know what he was doing. It was beautiful, but weird. It didn't sound like the Beach Boys." Capitol Records barely promoted the album. They didn't hear a hit single. Good Vibrations wasn't ready for release yet. To them, Pet Sounds wasn't commercial. It was a risk. Instead, they rushed out a greatest hits compilation just weeks later, undercutting the new release. They didn't believe in it. It's like they didn't even listen, Brian said. In America, the album stalled at number 10. Respectable, but a disappointment by Beach Boys standards. It sadly quickly faded from the charts. What can you say? It just wasn't made for those times. It was way ahead of what was playing then. And inside the Beach Boys, tensions deepened. Brian had poured his soul into the music, but not everyone was sure it still felt like theirs. What began as a collective vision had, for a time, become a solitary journey. Some bandmates questioned the new direction, in particular, Mike and Al. Some resented the intentional lack of commercial appeal. It just went too much against the Beach Boys formula. We begin to see Brian trying to assert more control over the Beach Boys, but some band members weren't entirely willing to hand over that much power. It was Brian's masterpiece, but it didn't bring us together. It kind of pulled us apart, Al says. But overseas, the response was different. The Beatles listened to it obsessively, and it played a major role in inspiring them to begin work on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul McCartney says, "Pet Sounds blew me out of the water. It was a total, complete, great album. I played it to John so much, it would be difficult to exaggerate how much we loved it."
I think he'd heard one of our albums and thought, I've got to do better, you know. And that was Pet Sounds, which I loved. It was like still one of my big albums, you know. It was so atmospheric and different.
Yes.
And yet it was the Beach Boys still, you know.
Yeah.
And we heard Pet Sounds and thought, right, we've got to do something better than that.
Yeah.
So we did Sgt. Pepper.
It's called the first concept album. It doesn't go anywhere. Mr. Kite, all my contributions have absolutely nothing to do with this idea of Sgt. Pepper and his band. But it works, because we said it worked, and that's how it appeared.
Yeah.
But it was not as put together as Pet Sounds.
Yeah.
The Beatles were going their way, and Brian was going his, and they were kind of looking over their shoulder and seeing what was coming up on the outside rail. And I think that was the effect of it. They wanted to experiment more. They wanted to do rather more outrageous things.
It blew a lot of minds. And a lot of very music-sensitive places, like in England, for instance. Bruce can tell you about that.
I took an American version of Pet Sounds in May of '66 to England, and then Keith Moon and I hit it off stupendously. And then Keith really, in his dream world of wishes, he would rather have been in Jan and Dean or the Beach Boys. Yet he does all this great drumming in The Who and enlisting all that. And he wanted to be, I don't want to say in a surf band, but he wanted to be in that kind of California, you know, musical style. Keith Moon and I did some clubbing, which was really fun, and a couple drop-ins and Ready, Steady, Go, you know, and Radio Fusion, and, you know, all that stuff. And Keith was probably 18 or 19. And then I got back, and I had a couple people meeting me, and Keith had brought Lennon and McCartney over to the hotel. And we were able to sit down. Now check this out. And I put it on my record player with the speakers in it. That's what I was able to get from the hotel to play music, okay? So I was able to play the mono, which sounded great. And then we played it through, and then we played it again. And Lennon and McCartney, they were awesome. They were so polite and cool and loved the music. It was a great experience. Usually it's don't shoot the messenger. Well, this time the messenger, you know, I almost got knighted, you know, because I brought this great work. I had nothing to do with it, you know. It's like someone rolls up the new Rolls-Royce Ghost, and someone has a camera, and I go, you know, take a bow for the car coming up. Apparently, the vibe of Wouldn't It Be Nice crept into Here, There, and Everywhere on the Revolver album. So I show up in England, and the messenger is not shot, and EMI, much to their credit abroad, I think Sloop John B was a hit in England at that time, and spreading around Europe. Well, they got right behind the album because of the reaction of a lot of the artists and the Beatles. So in England and Europe, Pet Sounds was a big deal. In America, you know, they're smiling and suggesting things and getting Best of the Beach Boys, Volume 1, ready. That means, oh, I guess it's almost over. Let's put that out. Brian put his whole life from the day he was born to that point in the Pet Sounds. And so you could reason it out with him, but that wouldn't fix the problem he must have had about it, because I know he knew, even with Sloop John B in it, I know he knew he had something wonderful, and I think the record label in America really let him down, and I think this, all of a sudden, this can't do anything wrong guy was made to feel, or probably felt that he'd done something wrong, and he probably started losing a little of his confidence.
So I think Brian's wonderful music really helped the Beatles bring Sgt. Pepper to life.
I think it was Carl's house at the beach, somebody's birthday. Paul McCartney was there, he was invited and did come by, and he and his wife, and he said, well, Brian, this morning I was driving along Mulholland Drive, playing Pet Sounds on me stereo, or whatever. I think he said, Pet Sounds on me stereo. Tears in me eyes, tears falling from me eyes. He says, when are you going to do another album like Pet Sounds, Brian?
With Pet Sounds, I wanted people to hear what I felt inside my soul, because I knew there's so much, I have such a big soul that I wanted to share it with people.
Brian did something in Pet Sounds. He was able to organize his thoughts to a point where they were hypnotic, but yet entertaining, meaningful, and spiritual too.
Brian Wilson had set out to make an album that could stand alongside the Beatles' Rubber Soul, and in the eyes of many, he surpassed it. But the initial acclaim for Pet Sounds was immediately diverted by the Beatles' successive releases. John Gilliland, in his 1969 Pop Chronicles series, says that the album was almost overshadowed by Revolver, released August 1966, and that a lot of people failed to realize that Brian's production was as unique in its own way as the Beatles was. Melody Maker journalist Richard Williams, in a 1971 reappraisal, wrote that although the album had defied criticism and briefly dwarfed all the rest of pop music, its critical attention was redirected when the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's 12 months later. No matter how hard Brian tried, the Beach Boys were just doomed to be overshadowed by their English counterparts. But time is a remarkable way of reshaping how we see and hear art. As of the writing of this documentary, Pet Sounds is listed as the second best album of all time by Rolling Stone magazine. The Beatles' Abbey Road sits at number 5. Not that this is definitive proof that any of them are better albums than one another. They're both amazing. It just goes to show how opinions can change. Pet Sounds' greatest ally turned out to be time. Over the decades, it has become one of the most revered albums in music history. It's studied in conservatories, imitated by producers, and adored by generations who weren't even born when it was made. Its emotional honesty has become its superpower. Its vulnerability is its strength. Brian paid a real price to create Pet Sounds. He gave the world his heart, and for a while, it nearly broke him. But in doing so, he gave music something it never had had before, a window into the soul of a young man who just wanted to be understood.
When you listen to Pet Sounds, use earphones in the dark, and you can hear everything.
If you close your eyes, you can see a place where something is happening. It's like being blind, but because you're blind, you can see more. Don't you think it's a spiritual kind of thing?